Beckett Calloway hadn't cried in years, burying his emotions deep inside. Not when they buried his father in the Calloway family plot overlooking Boston Harbor with half the city's underworld standing in black behind him. Not when his wife Nadine's car crossed the median on I-93 and the hospital chaplain walked toward him with that particular slowness that tells you everything before a single word is spoken. Not even when his 5-year-old daughter Colette, who'd been strapped into the back seat when her mother died 3 feet in front of her, stopped talking, stopped looking at anyone, stopped responding to her own name, and retreated into a silence so complete that the best child psychologists in Massachusetts couldn't find a door in, let alone open one. All those years without tears. He'd built an empire in that emotional drought shipping routes through Boston Harbor. Real estate that laundered itself clean through restaurants no one questioned. A name that made men lower their voices in rooms he hadn't even entered yet. Beckett Calloway didn't cry because crying required something he'd cut out of himself a long time ago. The way a surgeon removes a tumor necessary. Clinical. Permanent. And then one Tuesday night at 1:30 in the morning, his head of security called and said, "Boss, you need to see the basement camera. Right now." And Beckett sat in his dark office on Beacon Hill, watching the footage on his phone, and the thing he'd cut out of himself grew back in the space of 40 seconds. Because there on the screen, in the storage room where his dead wife Steinway sat under a white cloth like a body no one had permission to mourn, a woman he'd hired 6 weeks ago to clean his house was playing Debussy with her eyes closed, and his daughter, his silent, unreachable, lost little girl, was standing in the doorway, one small hand pressed flat against the wooden frame of the piano, feeling the vibrations move through the wood and into her fingers. For the first time in 2 years, Colette Calloway was choosing to be in the same room as another human being. He watched it 3 times. Then he put his phone down and pressed both hands over his face, the way his daughter never did, and he wept. What he did next, the decision he made before sunrise, is what this story's about. But I should warn you, before it's over, you'll learn that the woman at that piano wasn't there by accident, that her real name wasn't the one on her employment file, that her dead father's blood was on the hands of someone Beckett trusted more than anyone alive, and that the only thing more dangerous than a mafia boss who's found a reason to hope is the truth that's waiting to take it away from him. If this story touches something you didn't know you were looking for, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs it today. Subscribe and turn on the bell. A new story arrives here every single day, and the next one might be the one that stays with you. Now, let's go back to the night Beckett Calloway made the strangest decision of his life. The night a man whose hands hadn't ever been used for anything gentle sat down in front of a piano and asked a stranger to teach him how to play. But to understand why Beckett Calloway cried that night, you first have to understand the woman sitting beside the piano. The name on the hiring file was Margot Delacroix, 27 years old. No family, no record, no notable past, the kind of resume so clean it would have looked suspicious if anyone had bothered to look closely. But no one looked closely, because she was only the woman who mopped the floors, and in a house where men in suits carried guns under their arms and moved through the halls like office workers, no one paid attention to the woman holding a cleaning rag. Her real name was Margot Fontaine. Her father was Wyatt Fontaine, and 4 years earlier, that name had meant betrayal inside the Calloway empire. Wyatt had worked as chief accountant for the Calloway family for 12 years, the keeper of the books, the man who knew where every dollar went and where every dollar came from. The man trusted enough to sit in the room when the real numbers were opened. Then, one March morning, the FBI kicked in the door of the small apartment in Dorchester where Margot and her father lived. They read the arrest warrant. $12 million had vanished from the family accounts, and every trace pointed back to Wyatt Fontaine. The accusation was even heavier. He hadn't just taken the money, they said. He had also sold inside information to the FBI in exchange for a reduced sentence deal. He was sent to federal prison at Fort Devens, less than an hour's drive from Boston, yet as distant as another planet. Margot visited every week, sitting on the other side of the glass, watching her father grow thinner each time she saw him. He never confessed. He repeated the same sentence again and again, his voice weaker each time than the last, but his eyes never weakening. I didn't take a single dollar. I didn't say one word to them. The truth is, inside that house, you have to believe me. She believed him. She believed him with her whole heart. With 12 years of living beside a man who woke at 5 o'clock every morning, ironed his shirts with an old iron, drove to the Calloway mansion, worked 14 hours, then came home and cooked dinner for his daughter. That man didn't embezzle $12 million. That man didn't betray anyone. 18 months after the day he was arrested, Wyatt Fontaine died in his cell. The official report said suicide. Margot didn't believe it, just as she didn't believe anything they said about her father. The final letter arrived 1 week after the funeral, sent through a public defender, written on prison paper in handwriting that trembled but remained clear. The truth is, inside that house, find it. Don't let me die with this name. Before everything collapsed, Margot Fontaine had been a second-year student at Juilliard, the most prestigious arts school in America, studying piano performance on a full scholarship. Her professor had once told her she had rare hands, the kind of hands that didn't just play the notes, but could also play the silence between them, and that silence was where music truly lived. When her father was arrested, the scholarship was revoked, not because of anything she had done, but because the Fontaine name had become something no school wanted to be connected to. She lost her dorm room, lost her friends, lost her future, and she lost the music too, going 3 years without touching a piano key, because every time her fingers settled onto the keys, she heard her father's voice from the other side of the glass, and she couldn't bear it. For 3 years, she worked every job she could find, waiting tables in South Boston, cleaning hotel rooms in Back Bay, living in a windowless basement studio and making a plan. That plan brought her here, to the mansion on Beacon Hill. Inside the house her father had told her she had to enter. She didn't come to love anyone. She didn't come to play the piano. She came to find the truth her father had died before he could speak. And that night, when she passed the basement storage room and saw the Steinway beneath the white cloth, 3 years of silence in her fingers broke open all at once, and she sat down and played. Not because of the plan, not because of any purpose, but because she couldn't not play. And she didn't know that the music that night would change everything. For her, for the child standing outside the door, and for the man watching her through his phone screen, with tears running down his face. The next morning, Margot was summoned to the second floor, not by Mrs. Voss, as usual, but by Paxton Holt, the man she had worked around for 6 weeks inside this mansion without ever hearing him say more than 3 words in a sentence. He only said, "Follow me," then turned his back, and the way he walked, his steps even as though he were counting them, his shoulders straight, never once looking back, told Margot this wasn't a conversation. It was a summons. She followed Paxton down the second-floor hallway, past the walls hung with New England landscape paintings she had dusted dozens of times, and stopped before the oak door at the end of the corridor, the room she had never been allowed to set foot in during all 6 weeks. Paxton opened the door, stepped aside, and Margot entered Beckett Calloway's office. The desk was made of dark walnut, with not a single sheet of paper on it, not one drawer left even slightly open, the surface so clean it reflected the light coming through the window overlooking Boston Harbor. A glass of whiskey sat on the right side, untouched, the ice not yet melted, as though it had been poured not to drink, but to give him something to hold if he needed it. Beckett sat behind the desk. He didn't stand. He didn't ask her to sit. He looked at her with the kind of gaze she had learned to recognize after 6 weeks beneath this roof. A gaze that was judging, weighing, deciding something the person being watched had no right to know in advance. She was certain she was going to be fired. She had touched the piano everyone in the house knew was forbidden to touch, the piano that had belonged to his late wife, and she had broken the one rule even Paxton obeyed. She had already prepared an apology in her mind, brief, not servile, enough to keep her dignity, but also enough to buy time if she could. But Beckett spoke first. "You touched my wife's piano." His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. It was flat, like the surface of water before a storm, the kind of flatness that anyone who knew how to listen would understand was more dangerous than waves. Margot said nothing. She waited. In the world of servants, silence was a survival skill. Then he continued, and what he said wasn't something she could have anticipated in any version of the scene she had prepared. "I want you to teach me to play." Silence. Not her silence, but the silence of the whole room, of Boston Harbor beyond the window, of the ice in the whiskey glass seeming to stop melting. Beckett went on, his voice unchanged, as though he were presenting a plan to move shipments through the harbor, rather than asking the woman who mopped his floors to teach him piano. Dr. Lenore Ashby, the child psychologist, had reviewed the footage from the basement camera. She confirmed that Colette hadn't responded to piano music in general, but to the specific way Margot played, the tempo, the emotion, the trembling frequency of each note. It couldn't be randomly replaced with a recording or another musician. But Beckett didn't want to hire Margot to keep playing for his daughter forever. He wanted to be the one sitting at the piano himself, his own hands, so that if Colette responded again, she would be responding to her father, not to a stranger who could leave at any time. He said this not like a father begging, but like a man setting terms. Triple salary, lessons outside working hours, absolute secrecy. No one in the house was to know except Paxton. No negotiation. Margot stood there, looking at the man seated behind the spotless desk, and she understood this wasn't an offer. It was an agreement, the kind of agreement that, in Beckett Calloway's world, allowed only two answers: accept or leave, and she accepted. Not because of the tripled salary, not because of the 5-year-old child she hadn't yet had time to think about. She accepted because staying meant she could still step inside this house every day, still pass this office, still get close to the basement where old file boxes were stacked behind the piano storage room, where the truth about her father might be lying less than 10 steps away from the white cloth-covered Steinway. She said, "All right," a single phrase, and Beckett nodded. One single motion, and the agreement was sealed between two people who both left unspoken what they truly wanted. The first lesson took place the following evening in the basement storage room, beside Nadine's old Steinway, because Beckett didn't want anyone in the house to know, and the basement was the only place sealed off enough for secrecy. Margot pulled a chair beside the piano bench, and when Beckett sat down, she understood at once that this was going to be a battle. He sat before the piano the way he sat before everything in his life, his back straight as a ruler, his shoulders squared, his chin slightly lifted, his eyes lowered to the black and white keys, with an expression she could only describe as hostile. He didn't look at the keys as though they belonged to a musical instrument. He looked at them as though they were something that needed to be subdued. And when Margot told him to place his hands on the keys, he brought them down with enough force to make the piano tremble, as if it had been struck. She began with the C major scale, the most basic exercise, the kind any 7-year-old child in Juilliard prep could manage in the first week. Beckett Calloway, the man who controlled every transport route from Providence to Portland, couldn't do it. His hands were large, strong, used to the weight of things far heavier than piano keys, and they refused to cooperate. His third and fourth fingers stuck together, as though they had never been asked to move separately. Every time he tried to separate them, his fifth finger followed, and the sound that came out wasn't music. It was the wronged cry of a piano being tortured. Outside the storage room door, Paxton Holt stood guard, his face like stone, his back against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest, not a single muscle in his face moving. But through the crack in the half-open door, Margot saw his shoulders shake, very slightly, the kind of tremor that came from a man pouring all his strength into not laughing out loud. By the third lesson, Beckett played a sequence of notes Margot couldn't identify as any song, no matter how hard she tried to guess for a full 15 seconds. She said, trying to keep her voice normal, "You're striking the keys like you're punishing them. The piano isn't your enemy." Beckett stopped, looked at her, and in his eyes there was something she had never seen in 6 weeks of working inside this house. Not anger, not coldness, but truth, naked and uncovered. "I don't know any other way." 4 words. She heard them, and understood that he wasn't only talking about the piano. She looked at him, this 37-year-old man sitting before the instrument with hands so accustomed to violence that tenderness was a foreign language he had never learned, and she said, "Then learn." He didn't answer, but he placed his hands back on the keys, and this time, he was gentler. By the 5th lesson, he could play 5 notes in a row correctly. By the 7th, Margot began teaching him Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, the melody anyone in the world could recognize from the first 2 notes, the song every child hears before they hear almost anything else. Beckett practiced it with the concentration of a man defusing a bomb, 1 note at a time, so slowly it hurt, his fingers stiff as wood, but he didn't give up. By the 12th lesson, he played Twinkle, Twinkle from beginning to end, slowly, full of mistakes, but complete. Margot said nothing. She only nodded, because she knew that with a man like this, praise would unsettle him more than criticism. That night, she returned to the small room for the staff on the 1st floor and turned on the security camera feed through the tablet Beckett didn't know she had found the password for. She opened the storage room camera, and she saw him. At 2 a.m, Beckett Calloway sat alone before the old Steinway, playing Twinkle, Twinkle. At 3 a.m, he was still there. At 4 a.m, Still the same notes, over and over again, slower now, more careful, his fingers moving over the keys in the darkness of the storage room, with the patient desperation of a man trying to learn the only language that might reach his daughter. Margot turned off the tablet. She lay in the dark. And for the first time since stepping into this house, she felt something beyond hatred and purpose. Something she didn't want to name, because naming it would make everything she had come here to do 100 times more complicated. The change didn't come from one particular moment, but from the slow accumulation of evenings in the storage room, when the golden lamplight spilled over the keys, and two people sat beside each other close enough to hear the other breathe, yet far enough apart to pretend that nothing was changing. Beckett began to talk. Not much. Not in long stretches. Not like the kind of man who suddenly opened his heart the way people did in movies, but in small fragments that fell out between exercises, while his fingers were trying to remember where F-sharp was. He said Colette liked the morning sunlight, that she often stood beside her bedroom window when the sun came up, not looking outside, but watching the dust motes drift through the shaft of light, and she could stand that way for 30 minutes without moving. He said she arranged her toys by color, red with red, blue with blue, in perfectly straight rows on her bedroom floor, and if anyone shifted one plastic bear out of line, she would put it back immediately, without looking up, without expression, as though that order was the only thing that made sense in a world she could control. He said she held a stuffed rabbit when she slept, held it tightly, but never looked at it, never played with it, only held it, as if she needed the feeling of something in her hands, but didn't need to know what that something was. Margot listened to every small piece he gave her, and she realized this wasn't the way an employer spoke to a maid. This was the way a father spoke to the only person helping him reach his daughter. And that line, between employer and father, between agreement and trust, was blurring in front of them, and both of them knew it, though neither one pointed it out. One evening, after he finished an exercise, he asked her why she played piano so well but worked as a maid. There was no suspicion in his voice, only curiosity, the kind of curiosity that belonged to someone trying to fit together pieces that didn't match. Margot was silent for a while. Then she told him half the truth, the half she allowed herself to say without being exposed. I lost the most important person in my life. After that, every note sounded like crying. I couldn't bear it, so I stopped. She didn't say who. She didn't say when. She didn't say why. But her voice, when she said it, carried a weight no one could fake, and Beckett heard it. He looked at the keys, not at her, and said, I understand. I didn't touch my wife's piano for 2 years. It sat in the storage room under a white cloth, and I hired someone to tune it every month, but I never opened the lid, because I was afraid that if I heard it again, I'd hear her. And if I heard her, I wouldn't be able to bear the fact that she wasn't here anymore. The storage room went silent. The old Steinway sat under the white cloth in the corner like a mute witness, and Margot realized this was the first time Beckett Calloway had spoken the truth about his feelings, not to Paxton, who had followed him for 15 years, not to Dr. Ashby, not to his mother, but to her, the maid sitting beside him on a hard wooden chair in the basement at 10 o'clock at night. The following week, Margot began teaching him Brahms's lullaby. She chose it because it was a lullaby, because the final purpose of every lesson was for him to play for Colette, and there was no piece more fitting than the lullaby every child in the world deserved to hear from their father. The piece was harder than Twinkle Twinkle, demanding that the left hand keep a steady rhythm while the right hand carried the melody, and Beckett struggled with it. His fingers tried to be gentle, but they kept returning to old habits, strong and rigid, and Margot said, softer. This is a lullaby. You're putting a child to sleep, not chasing her awake. And he tried again, softer, but still not right. She placed her hand over his, without thinking ahead, without planning it. Her fingers rested on the back of his hand, pressing lightly, adjusting the angle of his wrist, and she said, like this, relax here, let gravity do the work instead of forcing it. And both of them stopped. Not stopped playing, because they had already stopped the moment she touched his hand. They stopped breathing. 3 seconds. Her hand on his hand, skin against skin, the storage room dim, the piano silent, and those 3 seconds lasted longer than any piece of music she had ever played. Neither of them pulled away. Then Margot withdrew her hand first, turned back to the keys, and said, try again, in a voice more normal than she truly felt. Beckett played again. This time, his wrist was softer, but he wasn't looking at the keys. He looked at her, quickly, only for an instant, then turned back. And in that look, there was something new. Not suspicion, not judgment, but recognition that the woman sitting beside him knew how to place a hand on piano keys in a way only someone trained for years would know. That she said, "Let gravity do the work," like a teacher, not an amateur player. That there were far too many things about her that didn't fit the file of a maid named Margot Delacroix, with no past, no family, and no history. He noticed, but he didn't ask. Beckett Calloway didn't ask questions until he was ready to hear the answer, and tonight, he wasn't ready for anything beyond the feeling of her fingers still lingering on the back of his hand, warm, light, and utterly unlike anything he had ever known. 6 weeks after the first lesson, a special delivery truck stopped in front of the Calloway mansion on Beacon Hill. 4 men carried in a brand-new Steinway Model B, $120,000, painted black and glossy as a lake at night, and placed it in the center of the main living room, where the afternoon light from the windows overlooking the harbor poured inside. The old piano still lay in the basement storage room, covered with a white cloth, belonging to Nadine, and Beckett never had any intention of moving it. The new one was his, for his child. Paxton stood watching as the workers installed it, adjusted it, tuned it, and when the piano technician left, he asked Beckett only one question. When? Beckett said, "Tonight." He ordered everyone to stay away from the main living room from 7 o'clock in the evening onward. Everyone. Mrs. Voss, the kitchen staff, the doorman, everyone. Paxton arranged it without asking anything more, because 15 years beside Beckett Calloway had taught him when his boss was giving a work order, and when his boss was doing something that, if it failed, would destroy him, and tonight belonged to the second kind. Margot was told to be present, but not to sit inside the room. Beckett told her a few hours earlier, his voice as clipped as always, but she heard the thing that 6 weeks of teaching him piano had taught her to recognize, the fear he hid beneath command. "Stand outside the door. If I play it wrong, I need to know where." She nodded. Both of them knew that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that he needed to know someone was there, behind the door, in case everything fell apart. At 7:15 in the evening, Beckett carried Colette down from her bedroom on the second floor to the living room. She was light in his arms, so light that sometimes he feared she would disappear if he didn't hold her tightly enough. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, her eyes lowered, her face expressionless, her body entirely relaxed in the way of a child who had grown used to letting other people decide where she would be, without needing to know why. He placed her on the gray velvet sofa, about 3 meters from the new piano, and she sat there the way she sat anywhere, quiet, distant, present but not truly there. Beckett stood watching his daughter for a while. Then he turned toward the piano. The new Steinway stood in the living room like a promise not yet fulfilled, glossy black under the lights, the lid already open, the white keys bright and waiting. He sat down on the piano bench, and his hands trembled. The hands that had once signed orders ending the careers of traitors without shaking at all. The hands that had once stayed clenched through negotiations where one wrong nod could cost people their lives. Those hands now hovered over the keys and trembled. He took a breath, set his fingers down, and played Brahms's lullaby. Slowly, slower than even the times he had practiced alone in the storage room at 3 o'clock in the morning. The first note was a little heavy, an old habit, but he corrected it at once, remembering Margot's voice saying, "Let gravity do the work." And the second note was softer. The third note landed in the right place, and the melody began to take shape. Not perfect, not smooth, with pauses, with places where his fingers struck the wrong key and then corrected themselves. But the melody was still there. The lullaby Margot had chosen for him. The piece of music every child in the world deserved to hear from their father. He reached the middle of the piece when he heard it, not with his ears, but with the instinct of a father who had spent 2 years watching every smallest movement of his daughter. A shift. He didn't turn around. He kept playing. But in the reflection on the piano lid, he saw Colette tilt her head. Just a little. The way she had done that night in the storage room when Margot played Debussy. Then she turned her face, not toward the window or the wall or empty space, the way she usually did. She turned toward the piano, and then she looked. Not at the instrument, not at the keys. Colette Calloway looked at her father, the pale brown eyes like her mother's, the eyes that for 2 years had never stopped on any face, the eyes Dr. Ashby had told him in the most careful voice possible might never find their way back. Those eyes were looking at him. Beckett stopped playing. His fingers remained on the keys. He couldn't breathe. He didn't turn around because he was afraid that if he turned, if he moved, if he did anything to break this moment, she would look away and he would lose her again. He sat there, his back turned to his daughter, watching her through the reflection on the piano lid, and she looked at him, and the world stopped. Outside the living room door, Margot stood in the dark hallway, one hand gripping the doorframe, and she cried. Without a sound, tears ran down her face, and she didn't wipe them away because she didn't want to miss a single second. She looked through the narrow crack of the half-open door, looked at the man sitting motionless before the piano, and the 5-year-old child looking at her father for the first time in 2 years. And in that moment, Margot Fontaine forgot who she was. She forgot the false identity, forgot her father's letter, forgot the boxes of records in the basement, forgot the truth she had traded 3 years of her life to find. She saw only a father being seen by his daughter. And that, in that moment, was enough to break every wall she had built. From that night on, 11 o'clock became a sacred hour in the Calloway mansion. Every night, when the hallway lights had all been turned off and the staff had withdrawn to their own rooms, when Boston outside had sunk into the rare relative quiet of a harbor city, Beckett carried Colette down from her bedroom to the living room, placed her on the gray velvet sofa, and sat before the new Steinway. He played Brahms's Lullaby, every night, the same piece, no changes. Because Dr. Ashby said repetition was the language autistic children trusted, consistency was the only way to build connection without creating pressure. And Beckett, a man who understood discipline better than anyone, turned 11 o'clock at night into a ritual that would never be broken. Not for a business call, not because Paxton brought urgent news, not for anything belonging to the empire he ran by day. By day, he was Beckett Calloway, the name that made people lower their voices. At night, at 11 o'clock, he was the father sitting before the keys, with hands that were still stiff, playing a lullaby 20% slower than the proper tempo, because his fingers wouldn't yet allow him to go faster. And Colette listened. Every night, she tilted her head, closed her eyes, sat still on the sofa with the stuffed rabbit in her lap, and listened. Progress came so slowly that anyone who wasn't looking closely would have missed it. On the third night, she tilted her head sooner, right from the first note, instead of waiting until the refrain. On the 7th night, she closed her eyes and her body relaxed completely, the kind of relaxation Dr. Ashby said the little girl had never shown in any therapy session, a sign of safety the body recognized before the mind could name it. On the 12th night, when the music ended and Beckett stood to carry his daughter upstairs, Colette did something new. She placed her hand on her father's hand. She didn't grip, she didn't embrace, she only placed it there. Her small hand resting on the back of his large one, light as a butterfly landing, and kept it there the whole way from the living room to her bedroom. Beckett climbed the stairs one step at a time with his daughter in his arms, her hand on his, and he walked as slowly as he could, because he wanted that staircase to be longer, wanted those 16 steps to become 100, wanted that moment not to end. Paxton saw all of it. He always saw all of it, because that was his job. And one evening, while Margot was washing glasses in the kitchen after work, Paxton came in for coffee and said, without looking at her, his eyes fixed straight on the machine, "I've followed him for 15 years. I've seen him walk into rooms ordinary people wouldn't walk into. I've seen him sit across from men where one mistake could mean death. I've never seen him afraid of anything." Paxton poured his coffee, still not looking at Margot. "But he's afraid of playing the wrong note in front of that little girl. Every night before he goes down to the living room, I see him stand outside Colette's bedroom door for at least 5 minutes, breathing, like an athlete before stepping onto the field. In 15 years, I've never seen him prepare himself mentally for anything." Then he walked out with his cup of coffee, leaving Margot alone in the kitchen with that sentence sitting in her chest like a stone. But Paxton wasn't the only one watching. That Saturday, Vivian Calloway came for dinner. She was 63 years old, lived in a smaller mansion 200 meters from the main house on the same estate, and came to dinner with her son every week, out of a habit no one in the house dared to change. She entered the dining room in a gray silk dress, her silver hair pinned high, her spine straighter than her son's, and her eyes, those eyes, swept across the room in a way Margot recognized at once, the gaze of someone who missed nothing, because she had lived 63 years in a world where missing one detail could be the difference between life and death. Margot served dinner that night, carrying plates, pouring wine, playing the proper role of the maid, and she felt Vivian's eyes on her throughout the meal, not glancing, not looking in passing, but looking, the kind of gaze with weight, the kind of gaze measuring something the person being watched wasn't allowed to know. Dinner ended. Beckett walked his mother to the door, and Margot cleared the table. She couldn't hear the conversation in the hallway, but she didn't need to, because Vivian didn't speak to her son. She spoke to Mrs. Voss. The housekeeper waited for her at the back door, loyal to Vivian since 30 years ago when Beckett had still been a child, and Vivian spoke to her in a low, quick, precise voice, the voice of someone who had spent a lifetime giving orders and never needed to repeat them twice. The new maid. She knows how to play Debussy. I hear my son hired her to teach piano. A pause. Maids don't know how to play Debussy, Adeline. Find out about her. Everything. Her real name, where she comes from, where she studied, what she did before she came here. Everything. Mrs. Voss nodded and didn't ask, because 30 years of serving Vivian Calloway had taught her that when the mistress said everything, the mistress meant everything. And the atmosphere inside the Calloway mansion, already heavy with the scent of secrets, began to grow heavier, with another layer of danger that Margot didn't yet know was quietly tightening around her. Teaching piano to Beckett gave Margot the one thing 3 years of planning couldn't buy: freedom of movement. Before, she was a maid, with a fixed schedule. The rooms she was allowed to enter so few they could be counted on one hand. The basement only for collecting laundry and cleaning the storage room, and no one asked what she was doing, because no one thought she could be doing anything that mattered. Now, she was the boss's piano teacher. The lessons stretched late into the night, and she had a valid reason to remain inside the mansion after working hours, to move through the basement, to pass between the piano storage room and the surrounding areas where before she'd had no excuse to set foot. And the area around the piano storage room, less than 10 steps down the basement hallway, was the old records room. Margot discovered that room during the second week of piano lessons, when she went looking for a cloth to wipe the piano and opened the wrong door. It was a small room, unlocked, filled with cardboard boxes labeled by year, the kind of room every rich family had, where papers too old to deal with but not important enough to lock in a safe were shoved away and forgotten. She memorized the location and waited. She waited 2 more weeks. Waited until her presence in the basement at night became normal. Waited until Paxton no longer checked the hallway every time she went downstairs. Waited until she became the most dangerous thing in any security system, part of the background scenery no one noticed anymore. Then, one night, after the lesson, when Beckett had gone upstairs with Colette and Paxton, had withdrawn to his own room in the east wing, Margot returned to the basement. She opened the records room door, turned on the flashlight on her phone, and began searching. She looked for the cardboard box labeled with the year her father had been arrested, 4 years earlier, and she found it on the 3rd row, covered in dust, wedged between 2 other boxes. Inside were files of financial transactions, ledgers, wire transfer receipts, copies of contracts, and on some of the papers, she saw her father's signature, Wyatt Fontaine's handwriting, slanting to the right, the capital F always curling into a long stroke, the handwriting she had spent 12 years seeing on birthday cards and notes left on the refrigerator. She touched the signature with her fingertip and had to bite her lip to keep from crying. But then she saw something else. Lying beside the file her father had signed was a second set of books, bound in brown leather, unlabeled, prepared by someone else. These books recorded a chain of transfers, $12 million, divided into multiple payments, moved to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands through 3 intermediary banks. Margot read every line carefully, and what she realized made her hands turn ice cold. Every transfer order required the highest level authorization signature. Her father had been the chief accountant. He recorded the books, tracked the money, but he didn't have the authority to authorize transfers on that scale. Within the Calloway family structure, only 2 people had the authority to sign an order involving $12 million. The boss, meaning Beckett's father, who had died 5 years earlier, and one other person, Vivian Calloway. Margot sat on the cold concrete floor of the records room, the set of books resting in her lap, the flashlight shining over the numbers, and she understood. She understood that 4 years earlier, $12 million had been moved by someone with signing authority. Then the blame had been placed on the man who kept the books, the only person who knew where the money had gone but had no power to decide where it went. Her father hadn't embezzled anything. Her father had discovered it, and because he had discovered it, her father had to die. The enemy wasn't Beckett. 4 years earlier, Beckett had been only 33, newly bereaved after losing his father, carrying the weight of the empire, and he might not have known, might have been kept in the dark, might have believed the version his mother told him. The enemy was the 63-year-old woman sitting in the mansion 200 meters away, the woman who had watched her through all of Saturday's dinner with eyes cold as steel, the woman who had ordered Mrs. Voss to investigate her, Vivian Calloway. And the most frightening thing wasn't that she had found the truth, but that the truth was coming toward her at the same time. Because while Margot sat on the basement floor reading the ledgers, in the mansion across the garden, Mrs. Voss was sitting before Vivienne with a thin report file. Margot Delacroix, the identity she had used to apply for the job, hadn't existed before 3 years ago. No birth certificate, no school records, no credit history, no trace of anything before the age of 24. A person who had appeared out of nowhere. Vivian listened, her face unchanged, and said to Mrs. Voss in a voice that anyone who knew her would recognize as her most dangerous voice, the calm one, "Get her fingerprints. From a water glass, from a door handle, anywhere. Send them to my people." She said nothing more. She didn't need to say more. 2 women were digging through each other's secrets on the same night, 200 meters apart, and neither one knew the other was searching too. 3 days after the night Margot found the set of ledgers in the basement. Mrs. Voss found her in the afternoon while she was wiping the second-floor hallway windows and said, in a voice so polite it felt false, that Mrs. Vivian wanted to see her at the private mansion, right now, because there was something she needed cleaned. Margot set the cloth down, and something in the way Mrs. Voss didn't look her in the eye, in the way the housekeeper said right now, as if it were a deadline and not an invitation, told her this wasn't about cleaning. She crossed the garden connecting the 2 houses, 200 meters of gravel path between neatly trimmed low hedges, and every step she counted felt heavier than the last. The mansion door was already open. No one greeted her. She stepped inside and followed the light to the living room, and Vivian Calloway's living room looked like a stage prepared in advance for a play in which she was the only actor who didn't know the script. Candles burned on the fireplace mantel. Red wine had already been poured into 2 glasses, but only one bore the mark of lips, and a large oil painting hung on the wall, portraying Vivian's late husband, Beckett's father, the previous Calloway boss, looking down into the room from inside the frame with eyes exactly like his son's, only colder. Vivian sat in a velvet armchair at the center of the room, her back not touching the chair, her hands resting on her knees, and on the coffee table in front of her lay a file. She didn't invite Margot to sit. She watched her standing there, and the silence stretched long enough for Margot to hear the candles burning. Then Vivian opened the file, turned the first page toward Margot, and Margot saw a photograph of her fingerprints, taken from the water glass she had used in the kitchen, placed beside the matching fingerprint image from the database system, and beneath it, her real name printed in black ink on white paper. Margot Fontaine. "Your real name is Margot Fontaine," Vivian said, her voice not loud, not angry, flat as stone, the kind of flatness Margot recognized at once, because she had heard a similar voice from Vivian's son for weeks. "Your father was Wyatt Fontaine, chief accountant, the traitor who sold this empire to the FBI 4 years ago, stole my family's money, sold my family's information, and destroyed everything my husband spent his life building." Vivian stopped, and in that pause, she took a sip of wine, slowly, as though this were an ordinary afternoon conversation between 2 women. "Your father died in prison, and that death was the proper consequence of what he did." Margot stood still, her hands tightened at her sides, her nails digging into her palms, and she felt her heartbeat pounding in her throat. But she didn't lower her head, didn't step back, didn't look away. She looked straight into Vivian's eyes in a way she was certain not many people in that woman's life had ever dared to do. Vivian continued, and her voice began to carry something more than stillness, something sharper. "You entered this house under a false identity. You approached my son. You approached my granddaughter." She leaned forward, and Margot saw the candlelight flicker in her eyes. "My granddaughter is a wounded 5-year-old child. And you used her, used the piano, used her response, to root yourself inside this house for your own personal purpose." A pause, and the next sentence came more slowly, every word clear as a nail being driven in. "You're exactly like your father. Margot heard that sentence and felt it like a blow to the chest, not because of the insult, but because of her father's name in the mouth of this woman. The woman she now knew had signed the transfer order for $12 million, and then blamed him. The woman who had sat still while her father was arrested, imprisoned, and killed, then called his death the proper consequence. She wanted to scream. She wanted to overturn the table, wanted to throw the file in Vivian's face, wanted to say, "I know what you did. I saw the ledgers. I know who signed the transfer order." But she didn't, because saying it now would mean exposing the only card she had before she had the chance to use it. Instead, she said, her voice trembling but not breaking, each word held straight the way she was holding her spine straight. "My father didn't betray anyone. He died because of someone else's lie, and I'll prove it." Vivian looked at her, and for 1 second, something flashed through her eyes, quick, almost impossible to catch. Not fear, but the recognition of someone facing a person who wasn't as easy to frighten as she had thought. Then it vanished, and her face returned to stone. "Tomorrow morning my son will know who you are," Vivian said, setting her wineglass down with a soft click against the wooden table. "And once he knows, you'll disappear from this house, from my granddaughter's life, within 1 hour. I guarantee it." She said nothing more. She turned back to look at her husband's portrait on the wall, as if Margot had become heir, and the conversation ended not with a farewell, but with erasure. Margot turned, walked out of the mansion, and crossed the 200 meters of gravel path again in the fading afternoon light. And she didn't cry, because she had no time to cry, because tomorrow morning Vivian would tell Beckett, and everything she had built inside this house, every piano lesson, every night sitting beside him in the storage room, every moment watching Colette tilt her head and listen to the music, all of it would end before she had the chance to use the truth she had just found to save her father's name. Vivian arrived at the main mansion at 8 o'clock the next morning, earlier than any visit she had made in the past 2 years, and Paxton knew at once that something was wrong because she hadn't called ahead, hadn't informed Mrs. Voss. She simply appeared at the door with a file in her hand and demanded to see her son. Beckett was sitting in his office, his coffee still hot, the laptop screen open on the desk with the transport numbers he reviewed every morning before the world began demanding his attention. Vivian walked in, closed the door behind her, and placed the file on his desk directly on top of the laptop keyboard without asking permission. She told him in a quick, precise voice, without one unnecessary word, the voice of someone who had practiced this speech all through the night before. The maid named Margot Delacroix didn't exist. Her real name was Margot Fontaine, daughter of Wyatt Fontaine, the traitor from 4 years earlier. She had infiltrated the mansion under a false identity, approached Beckett through the role of piano teacher, approached Colette, and could be a spy for the FBI, could be working for a rival family, could be both. She said she's dangerous 3 times in 5 minutes. And each time she said it, another layer of urgency entered her voice, though Beckett wasn't sure whether that urgency was real or calculated. When she finished, Beckett said nothing. The silence in the office grew so heavy that Vivian had to stop herself from filling it. He looked at the file on the desk, the fingerprint photograph, the real name, the cross-checked background, and he didn't think about threats or spies or the FBI. He thought about the basement storage room. He thought about the woman sitting beside him on the hard wooden chair, saying, "Let gravity do the work," and placing her hand on his for 3 seconds, neither of them pulling away. He thought about her standing behind the living room door the night he played for Colette for the first time, and he hadn't seen her then, but Paxton later told him she had cried. He thought about the sentence she had said, "I lost the most important person in my life," and now he knew who that person was. Wyatt Fontaine, the traitor the Calloway Empire had dealt with 4 years earlier. It didn't hurt, because he had been deceived. It hurt because he had begun to trust her, and Beckett Calloway didn't trust people easily. So when he did trust someone, it meant something. And when that trust was betrayed, it meant twice as much. "Call her up here," he said to Paxton, his voice flat, without looking at his mother. Vivian began to say more, but Beckett cut her off with a single look, the kind of look that, according to Paxton, had once made men twice her age sit back down in their chairs, and she fell silent. Margot stepped into the office for the second time in her life, and this time was entirely different from the first. The first time, she had entered with a false identity and the fear of a maid who thought she was about to be fired for touching a piano. This time, she walked in and saw the open file on the desk, saw her fingerprints, saw her real name printed on the paper, and she knew everything was over. Vivian sat on the sofa by the window, silent, watching. Beckett sat behind the desk, didn't stand, and said only 2 words. Real name. It wasn't a question. It was an order. And Margot, standing in the middle of the office with the morning light from Boston Harbor shining against her back, decided in one instant that she wouldn't lie anymore. No half-truths, no circling around, no begging for mercy. She spoke. She said her real name was Margot Fontaine. Her father was Wyatt Fontaine, chief accountant, accused of embezzling $12 million and selling information to the FBI. Her father had been arrested, imprisoned at Fort Devens, and died in his cell 18 months later. She said her father had written her one final letter, saying he hadn't taken a single dollar, saying the truth was inside this house. She said she had created a false identity, applied for a maid's job, and entered the mansion with one purpose only, to find evidence that would clear her father's name. She said it all, every word, her eyes fixed straight on Beckett's, not blinking, not lowering, not pleading. Then she said the final sentence, and for the first time, her voice carried something beyond forced calm, something real, fragile, and without armor. I came here to find the truth. I didn't come to hurt you or Colette. And I didn't expect, she stopped, swallowed, that I would care. The room went silent. Vivienne on the sofa leaned forward slightly as if ready to speak, but Beckett didn't look at her. He looked at Margot, and on his face was a war she could see but couldn't help him fight. The war between the father who had watched his daughter look at him for the first time because of this woman, and the man who had just learned he had been deceived by that same woman. The war ended quickly. Maybe it had ended before she walked into the room. "Get out of my house," he said, his voice flat as the walnut desktop in front of him. Not angry, not shouting, flat, and that flatness was worse than any scream. "Tonight," Margot nodded. "Once." She turned and walked out of the office, and she didn't look back. She returned to the small room on the first floor, packed her belongings into the only canvas bag she had brought to this house 6 weeks earlier, and the process took less than 10 minutes because she didn't own much. Before leaving, she went up to the second floor, not because of the plan, not because of any purpose, but because her feet carried her there before her mind could stop them. She stopped outside Colette's bedroom. The door was slightly open. Inside, the nightlight cast a pale golden glow, and Colette was asleep, lying on her side, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her face peaceful in the way only children can be peaceful when they sleep, knowing nothing about the things breaking around them. Margot stood at the door and looked. She didn't step inside, didn't touch, only looked, and she thought, this little girl didn't know who she was, didn't know her name, didn't know what she had come here to do, but this little girl had placed her hand on the wooden frame of the piano when Margot played music, and somehow, in her silent world, Colette had chosen her before anyone in this house had given her the chance to be chosen. She turned away, went down the stairs. Out the front door, Paxton stood at the door, said nothing, only opened it for her. And in his eyes there was something she wasn't sure was pity or respect, or both. Margot Fontaine left the Calloway mansion at midnight, with the canvas bag on her shoulder and the truth about her father still lying in the basement records room, where she hadn't had time to take anything with her except memory. The following night, exactly at 11 o'clock, Beckett carried Colette down to the living room as he did every night. He placed her on the gray velvet sofa, with her stuffed rabbit in her arms and her eyes lowered, and he sat before the new Steinway. He played Brahms's Lullaby. The same piece, the same tempo, the same notes his fingers had learned by heart after hundreds of repetitions in the storage room at 3 o'clock in the morning. Colette didn't tilt her head. He played the entire piece. She didn't look up. He started again from the beginning, slower, softer, trying to recreate the exact tempo Margot had taught him, trying to remember the way she had said, "Let gravity do the work," trying to let his fingers fall onto the keys instead of pressing them down. Colette sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the empty space in front of her, the stuffed rabbit lying still in her lap. And she wasn't here. She was inside the silent world she had built around herself since the day her mother died, the world the sound of the piano had once opened a door into, and now that door had closed again. On the second day, he tried again. On the third day, the fourth day, every night, at 11 o'clock, the same piece, the same piano, the same sofa, the same golden light. And every night, Colette sat there like a small statue. Present but not truly there. Breathing but not living. Exactly like the little girl Dr. Ashby had described in the report 18 months before she first came to the mansion. By the 5th day, Beckett called Dr. Ashby. She came in the afternoon, sat in the living room, reviewed the camera footage from the nights before Margot left and the nights after, compared Colette's responses, took notes, and when she looked up at Beckett, her face carried an expression he had learned to hate. The expression of a professional preparing to say something the listener didn't want to hear. She formed a connection, Dr. Ashby said, choosing every word carefully, like someone walking across broken glass, not only with the piano music, but with that specific person playing the piano. Her brain attached the music to that woman's presence, her scent, her breathing, the way she sat, the specific vibration frequency when she played. All of it created a sensory package Colette recognized as safety. When you play, she hears the piano, but the rest is missing. And when that source of safety disappears abruptly, she stopped, looking at Beckett. She experiences it as another loss, another Nadine leaving. Beckett sat across from Dr. Ashby, and he said nothing. He had heard bad news many times in his life, the kind of bad news other people needed alcohol to endure, the kind of bad news that came with guns and compensation money, and sometimes with people disappearing, but none of it struck him the way that sentence did. Another Nadine leaving. His daughter had lost her mother on Interstate 93, and now, inside the small, silent world she had built to protect herself, she had just lost someone else too. The woman who had played Debussy in the storage room that night, the woman she had chosen. And Colette had lost her, because he was the one who had driven her away. Dr. Ashby left. Vivienne called that evening, her voice calm as she asked about Colette, as though she hadn't been the one who lit the fuse on all of it. And Beckett said, "Colette is fine," then hung up, and both of them knew it was a lie. That night, he didn't play the piano. He sat in his dark office, with no lights on, a glass of whiskey on the desk, though he didn't drink it, and he thought, not about Margot, or at least that was what he told himself. He thought about the sentence she had spoken in this office, standing in that exact place, with the Boston Harbor sunlight shining against her back, her eyes straight on his, not begging, not crying. My father didn't betray anyone. He died because of someone else's lie. Beckett had heard many people lie in his life. He survived by knowing how to separate lies from truth. It was a basic survival skill in his world, and liars always had tells, eyes that moved, a voice lifting half a note higher, hands tightening or twisting a ring, something slightly off. Margot hadn't been off. Her voice when she said, "My father didn't betray anyone," carried a weight he recognized, because he had heard his own voice carry that same weight. Exactly like his voice when he spoke of Nadine. His voice when he said, "My wife didn't deserve to die on that highway." The voice of someone telling a truth no one believed. A truth that couldn't be proven by documents but lived in the bones, in the blood, in the way a person didn't blink when saying it aloud. He sat in the darkness for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Paxton. It was 2:00 in the morning, but Paxton answered after the first ring, because 15 years beside Beckett Calloway had taught him that a call at 2:00 in the morning was never something that could wait. "The Wyatt Fontaine case," Beckett said, his voice low, slow, every word weighed. "4 years ago. I want everything reviewed. Financial records, transfer orders, FBI reports, all of it." A pause. "Not through my mother. Don't tell my mother. Not one word." Paxton was silent for a second, and in that second of silence was the sound of a man who had just heard the thing he had feared would come but hoped wouldn't. Then he said, "Understood, boss," and hung up. Paxton took 4 days. 4 days digging through files that, 4 years earlier, he had personally watched being created, signed, and locked inside cabinets to which only the Calloway family had keys. He began where Beckett told him to begin, with the money trail. Because in their world, every truth lived inside the money trail. People could lie with words, but money didn't know how to lie. Wherever money went, it left a trace, and traces didn't erase themselves. $12 million had left the Calloway family accounts 4 years earlier, divided into 9 transfers through 3 intermediary banks, before reaching an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Every transfer order on that scale, according to the internal rules Beckett's father had established 20 years earlier, required the highest level authorization signature, and Paxton knew that rule because he was the one who enforced it. Wyatt Fontaine had been the chief accountant. He recorded the books. He tracked the money. He knew where the money went and where it came from, but he didn't have the authority to order the money to move. Paxton checked the 9 transfer orders, one by one, and on every order, on the authorization signature line, Wyatt Fontaine's signature wasn't there. Vivian Calloway's signature was. 9 times. 9 orders. The same stroke of the pen Paxton had seen on hundreds of other documents throughout 30 years of her signing beside her husband. But that still wasn't what made Paxton call Beckett at 1 o'clock in the morning on the 4th day. That came from Garrett Mercer. Mercer was Beckett's subordinate, in charge of the southern transport route, a man Paxton had suspected for 2 years but had never had enough evidence to bring to Beckett. Paxton knew Mercer had contact with Desmond Whitfield, the boss of the rival family in Providence, and he had been quietly watching Mercer all that time. During that surveillance, Paxton discovered that Mercer kept an encrypted digital file on a separate hard drive, the kind of file people in their world called life insurance, the thing a subordinate kept to make sure a superior would never dare remove him. Paxton had gotten the file 3 days before Beckett's call at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he had decrypted it but hadn't listened, because he wasn't sure he wanted to know what was inside. Now he listened, and he understood why Mercer had kept it. The file was a phone call recording, 7 minutes and 12 seconds long, between Vivian Calloway and Desmond Whitfield, recorded 4 years earlier, 2 weeks before the day Wyatt Fontaine was arrested. Paxton brought the hard drive to Beckett's office at 1 o'clock in the morning. He placed it on the walnut desk, connected it to the laptop, opened the file, and said, "Boss should hear this himself." Then he stepped out and closed the door, because there were some things even the most loyal man knew he shouldn't be present for when they happened. Beckett pressed play. His mother's voice rose in the dark office, her voice from 4 years earlier, a little younger, a little sharper, but impossible to mistake for anyone else's. She was talking to Whitfield about the money transfer, about the agreement, about how she had taken $12 million from the family accounts to fund a private deal between herself and Whitfield, a deal her husband, the previous Calloway boss, didn't know about, a deal she had made behind his back, while he was gravely ill, and the empire was shaking under the pressure of Whitfield's threat of war. Then her voice changed, from the voice of negotiation to the voice of command, and she said, clearly, every word sharp as a knife, "Fontaine saw the books. He knows where the money went. Handle him before he tells my son." Whitfield asked. "Handle him how?" And Vivian said, "Any way you want, as long as when it's done, no one believes a word he says." The recording ended. The office went silent. Beckett sat behind the desk, the laptop screen still glowing, the audio file showing its progress bar at the end. And he sat there. He didn't slam the desk, didn't throw the glass, didn't call anyone. He sat and understood, piece by piece, how the truth fit together like fragments of a puzzle he had been looking at for 4 years, without realizing he was looking at the wrong picture. His mother had taken $12 million behind his father's back. Wyatt Fontaine had discovered it because he was the chief accountant, because seeing the money trail was his job. Vivian had blamed Wyatt because he was the only person who could bring her down. She arranged for him to be arrested, imprisoned, branded a traitor, and he died in a cell, with no one believing a word he said. And his daughter, 23 years old at the time, lost her father, lost Juilliard, lost everything, then spent 3 years planning her way back into this house to find the truth. And when she found it, when she stood in this office and looked straight into Beckett's eyes and said, "My father didn't betray anyone, he had thrown her out," Beckett closed the laptop. He sat in the darkness for a long time, long enough for the whiskey on the desk to warm to room temperature, long enough for the first light of Boston dawn to begin seeping through the curtains. Then he stood, and the man who rose from that chair was no longer the same man who had sat down in it 6 hours earlier. Beckett walked the 200 meters from the main mansion to Vivian's villa at 7 o'clock in the morning, before anyone in the house had woken, before Paxton had time to ask whether he needed to come along, before Beckett could allow himself to think twice. He carried the hard drive in the pocket of his coat, weighing less than half a kilogram, yet heavier than anything he had ever carried. He didn't call ahead. He rang the doorbell and waited, and when she opened the door in her morning robe, her silver hair not yet pinned up, her face without makeup, she looked at him and knew at once. He saw it in her eyes, flashing past as quickly as lightning but real, the moment she realized her son standing at her door at 7 o'clock in the morning had not come to visit but to judge, and she knew, with the instinct of someone who had spent 63 years always staying ahead of every confrontation, that this time she was not ahead. She stepped aside to let him in. No words. Beckett crossed the living room, the same room where Vivian had sat in the armchair a few days earlier, and exposed Margot. The candles now extinguished, the wine glasses cleared away, but the portrait of her late husband still hanging on the wall, looking down. He placed the hard drive on the coffee table, connected it to the small speaker he had brought with him, and pressed play. Vivian's voice from 4 years earlier filled the room. Her voice, when she had been a little younger, a little sharper, negotiating with Desmond Whitfield about $12 million, about the agreement made behind her husband's back, about the transport route she had sold to their rival, in exchange for Whitfield's promise not to attack the Callaway Empire while her husband was dying. Then her voice said that sentence. Fontaine saw the books. Handle him before he tells my son. Beckett watched his mother as the recording played. She sat in the armchair, the same chair where she had sat when she faced Margot, and her face did not change. Not one muscle moved. She didn't close her eyes, didn't turn away, didn't show anything an outsider could read, but her hands could not hide it. Both her hands gripped the ends of the armrests, and her knuckles were white, so white Beckett could see the bones beneath the skin, and he knew that underneath the marble surface his mother had built over 63 years. Everything was collapsing. The recording ended. The small click when the file stopped sounded in the room like a gunshot. Silence. It stretched long enough for Beckett to hear the clock on the wall above the fireplace, the birds outside the window, Boston waking beyond their estate with no knowledge of what was happening inside. You killed an innocent man, Beckett said, his voice low. Even, without rise or fall, the voice Paxton would have recognized as the most dangerous one he had, the voice he used when he had already decided everything before opening his mouth. You let him die in prison. You'd destroyed his daughter's life. His daughter lost her father, lost her school, lost her future, lost 3 years of her life planning her way into this house to find the truth. He stopped. Then when she came, you sat in that exact chair, looked into her face, and said her father deserved to die. Then you came to my house, looked into my face, and told me she was a threat. Vivian opened her mouth, and when her voice came out, it still held the shape of calm, but only the shape. Inside, it was hollow. Everything I did was to protect this family. Your father was dying. The empire was shaking. Whitfield was threatening war. I had to choose. I chose to protect what your father built. No, Beckett said, and that word cut through Vivian's voice like a blade through paper. You didn't protect the family. You protected yourself. Because you made a deal behind my father's back. You took $12 million without my father knowing. You sold the transport route to Whitfield without my father knowing. And when Fontaine found out, you weren't afraid of Whitfield. You were afraid of my father. You were afraid my father would know you had betrayed him. You were afraid of losing your place in the family he built. So you killed the man who kept the books and called him a traitor so no one would look at you. Silence. And this time, the stone face of Vivian Callaway cracked. Not in a dramatic way. Not with collapse. Not with screaming. Not with falling to her knees. It cracked the way real stone cracks. Slowly, deeply, beginning from inside and spreading outward until the whole structure lost the ability to hold its shape. Tears ran down her face, and she cried without making a sound, both hands still gripping the armrests, her back still straight, because even while falling apart, Vivian Callaway fell apart with perfect posture. She didn't cry like someone who had accidentally caused harm without knowing what she had done. She cried because she had known. She had chosen. She had watched Wyatt Fontaine be pushed into hell and had turned her back. And after 4 years of living with that decision, 4 years of telling herself it had been necessary, that it had been done to protect the family, 4 years of that armor, it was now stripped away by her own son, and what remained underneath was not strength, but an old woman who knew she had done something that could never be undone. Beckett stood. He looked at his mother, and there was no anger on his face, no hatred, no contempt. There was something worse than all of those things, the disappointment of a son seeing clearly, for the first time, who his mother truly was. You're still my mother, he said, but you're no longer someone I trust. He walked out of the room. He closed the door behind him, gently, almost without a sound, the way a man closes a door when he doesn't need force to show what he means. And that quiet closing sounded inside Vivian Callaway's villa, heavier than any gunshot this family had ever heard. Paxton found her within 3 hours. It wasn't difficult. Because Margot Fontaine wasn't someone who knew how to disappear. She had no network, no backup identity, no money to go far. She was only a 27-year-old woman with a canvas bag and the wreckage of 3 years of planning that had collapsed in a single night. The motel sat on the western edge of Boston, on the road leading out of the city, that people with no money left often used, because it had rooms for $49 a night. The kind of place where the neon sign outside blinked vacancy day and night, because there was always an empty room. The kind of place people didn't come to live in, only to have somewhere to lie down while they figured out the next step. Margot's room was on the first floor, at the end of the row, the curtains drawn tight, no light leaking out. Paxton gave Beckett the address and asked, "Do I come with you?" Beckett said no. He drove alone, in the black Audi, through the Boston streets he owned no small part of, past the harbor where his ships moved in and out every night, across the city line into the suburbs where his name no longer made anyone lower their voice, and stopped in front of the motel with its cracked parking lot and broken soda machine outside the lobby. He sat in the car for 1 minute, 2 minutes. Beckett Calloway wasn't a man who hesitated. He made million-dollar decisions in 30 seconds, signed orders that changed other people's lives without blinking. But sitting here, in front of the door to a $49 motel room, he hesitated, because what he was about to do didn't belong to any skill he had learned in 37 years of living. He got out of the car, walked to the door at the end of the row, knocked. 2 knocks, not hard, not soft. Loud enough to be heard, but not enough to frighten. And he realized he was measuring the force of his own knock, something he had never done in his life. The curtain inside shifted. A silence followed, long enough for him to know she was looking through the gap in the curtain, seeing him, deciding whether to open the door or not. Then the door opened. Margot stood in the doorway, her hair tied back in haste, wearing a wrinkled gray t-shirt, her face bare of makeup, her eyes shadowed with the dark circles of someone who hadn't slept for many nights. And behind her was a small room with a single bed, the canvas bag on the floor still unopened, and nothing else. She looked at him, said nothing, didn't invite him in, didn't close the door, didn't step back, didn't step forward, only stood there and looked at him with eyes he recognized as waiting. Not waiting for what he would say, but waiting to see what would happen next in the long chain of terrible things life had taught her to expect. "Your father's innocent," Beckett said. 3 words. He said them standing in front of a motel door, beneath the blinking neon light, face to face with the woman he had thrown out of his house at midnight the week before, and he didn't say them like he was reading the results of an investigation. He said them like a man who had just found something, and finding it had changed everything he thought he knew. "I have proof. A recording. Financial records. 9 transfer orders with authorization signatures that weren't your father's." He stopped. "And I know who's guilty." He didn't say Vivian's name. He didn't need to. She knew. She had known since the night she found the set of ledgers in the basement. Silence. Wind swept across the parking lot, carrying the smell of hot asphalt and the distant sound of trucks moving along the highway. And Beckett Calloway, boss of the empire that controlled Boston Harbor, the man Paxton had never once heard apologize to anyone in 15 years, said, "I'm sorry." 2 words. He said them, and they didn't come easily. He said them like a man lifting a stone with his tongue, because apologizing demanded admitting he had been wrong, and Beckett Calloway had built his entire empire on the foundation of never being wrong. But he had been wrong. He had driven her away when he should have listened. He had believed his mother when he should have questioned. He had let his daughter lose one more person when he should have held on. Margot looked at him, and she didn't cry, didn't embrace him, didn't forgive him with words, because she wasn't someone who gave anything away easily. She said, her voice even, her eyes straight, "My father is cleared, publicly, on every record, every document, before everyone who ever heard his name tied to the word traitor. That's the condition. It'll be done within the week," Beckett said, without hesitation, because this was territory he knew, the territory of action, of promises carried out, and he would carry it out the way he carried out everything, thoroughly and without debate. Then he added something, and this part he hadn't prepared. It left his mouth before his mind had time to approve it. "You come back under your real name, Margot Fontaine. No disguise, no other identity. I need someone to teach my daughter piano." He stopped, and the next sentence came lower, slower, almost not the voice of a Mafia boss at all, but the voice of a man standing outside a $49 motel room at midday, with sunlight on his face. "And I need you." He said it, and only then heard himself say it, and he didn't take it back. Because Beckett Calloway didn't take back anything he had said. That was a principle. But this time the principle lined up with the truth, and the truth was that he needed her, not only because of Colette, not only because of the piano, but because of something he wasn't ready to name yet, something already real enough to make him drive alone to a motel in the suburbs, knock on the door of a 27-year-old woman's room, and say "I'm sorry" for the first time in his life. Margot Fontaine returned to the Calloway mansion on a Thursday afternoon, through the front door, under her real name. Not the kitchen door where the maids came and went, not the side passage through the backyard, but the front door, the heavy oak door that 6 weeks earlier she had only been allowed to look at from the inside while cleaning the glass. Paxton opened the door for her, and he nodded once, brief, without speaking. But that nod was different from the one he had once given the maid named Delacroix. There was something close to recognition in it, as though Paxton Holt, the man who had stood guard outside the storage room door, listening to his boss play as if he were torturing the keys, was now opening the door for someone he knew would stay. Beckett stood in the hallway, and when she stepped inside, he looked at her, and she looked at him, and between them lay everything that had happened. The storage room, the piano keys, the 3 seconds when hand touched hand, her father's letter, the recording of his mother's voice, the door of the $49 motel, and no one said anything because there was no need. He led her into the living room where the new Steinway stood in the afternoon light, and he said, "Colette will come down in 5 minutes." Margot sat before the piano. She placed her hands on the keys, and this time was different from every time before. The first time she played in the storage room, she had played for herself, for the ache of missing her father, for 3 years of silence breaking open. This time, she played for the child. She played Claire de Lune, Debussy. The piece from that night, the first piece, the music Colette had heard through the vibrations passing through the wooden frame of the old Steinway in the basement storage room, and had chosen to step into the room. The first note fell into the living room like a drop of water falling onto the surface of a still lake, and the melody spread outward, slowly, tenderly, with the precision and feeling of someone trained at Juilliard, yet playing not through technique, but through everything she had lost and everything she was hoping to find again. Beckett carried Colette in. The little girl sat on the sofa, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her eyes lowered, and the music reached her. Margot didn't look back. She kept playing, her eyes closed, her fingers moving across the keys by the memory of the body, and she heard, with the hearing of a pianist used to listening to every sound in a room, small footsteps on the wooden floor. Colette rose from the sofa. She walked toward the piano, step by step, slowly, and she stood beside the piano bench, beside Margot, and placed her small hand on Margot's hand over the keys, not on the wooden frame the way she had done that night in the storage room, on her hand, skin against skin, small fingers resting on the back of the hand that was making music. And Margot felt that weight, light as nothing and heavier than everything, and she kept playing, tears running down her face, but her fingers didn't stop, because she knew that if she stopped, the moment would break, and this moment, the moment when a 5-year-old autistic child touched someone who wasn't her father for the first time, this moment wasn't allowed to break. Beckett stood at the living room door. Paxton stood behind him. Both were silent, and Paxton, the man who had followed Beckett for 15 years through every war, every negotiation, every long night in the underworld, watched his boss look at the 2 people beside the piano, and he knew. He later told Mrs. Voss in the kitchen, over a cup of coffee, his voice low as if afraid someone might hear. "I saw the boss looking at them, the girl playing, and the child placing her hand on hers, and I knew that wasn't the look of an employer looking at staff. That was the look of a man who knew he had found something he would never let go." The following week, everything moved quickly in the way Beckett Calloway did everything, thoroughly and without delay. Vivian wrote an official confession letter and sent it to the family lawyer, confirming that she had signed the 9 transfer orders for $12 million, confirming that Wyatt Fontaine had no involvement in the embezzlement, confirming that she had arranged for him to be blamed. Wyatt Fontaine's name was cleared from every internal record tied to the word betrayal. Beckett signed the official order in the family system, and when Paxton asked what reason he wanted written for the exoneration, Beckett said, "Write the truth. He was innocent. Write it exactly that way." Before leaving Boston, Vivienne met Margot once. The meeting took place in the villa living room, the room where a few weeks earlier she had sat in the armchair and exposed Margot with the fingerprint file. This time, she didn't sit in the armchair. She stood, and Margot stood across from her, and between them was the empty coffee table. No file, no wine, no candles. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Vivienne said, her voice calm but thin, the kind of thinness that belonged to something worn down too far and nearly pierced through, "because I don't deserve forgiveness for what I did to your father." Margot looked at her, at the 63-year-old woman standing before her with no armor left, no velvet armchair, no power of a matriarch in the shadows, only an old woman with a sin too large to carry and too real to deny. "I won't forgive you," Margot said. And she told the truth, because her father had died in a cell, alone, and no apology could ever be large enough for that. "But I won't let it turn me into someone my father wouldn't want me to become." Vivienne looked at her for a while, and in her eyes there was something Margot recognized but didn't want to name, something almost like gratitude for not being completely destroyed by the person who had every right to destroy her. Then she turned away. Vivienne Calloway left Boston 1 week later, moving to a small house on the coast of Maine, alone, without a housekeeper, without Mrs. Voss, without anyone. She didn't die. In the original story, the Dowager passed away peacefully after being forgiven. Vivienne wasn't given that. Vivienne lived, waking each morning in an empty house looking out over the sea, carrying every day the weight of the decision she had chosen 4 years earlier. And for someone like Vivienne Calloway, living with guilt was far heavier than death. In the weeks that followed, Beckett Calloway did what he did best. He destroyed his enemy. But this time, he didn't use guns or threats. He used the very thing his mother had given Whitfield 4 years earlier: information. The recording of the call between Vivienne and Desmond Whitfield didn't only prove his mother's guilt, it also contained details about every transport route Whitfield had bought with those $12 million. Which routes, through which ports, who operated them, who protected them. Beckett didn't need to attack head-on. He only needed to let the information reach the right people. And in the underworld, the right information, in the right hands, at the right time, was a weapon no armor could stop. He leaked details about Whitfield's southern transport route to 2 rival families in Newark and Philadelphia. Families that had lost territory to Whitfield 4 years earlier because of the very route Vivienne had sold. They received the information, verified it, and acted faster than Beckett had expected. Within 3 weeks, the southern transport route was cut off. By the 5th week, Whitfield's 2 main money-laundering restaurants in Providence were shut down after a surprise inspection by the federal tax authorities, something Beckett hadn't arranged directly, but also didn't prevent. By the 8th week, Whitfield's financial partner in the Cayman Islands stopped cooperating after receiving copies of the ledgers proving Whitfield had used the offshore account for deals outside their agreement. By the 3rd month, Whitfield's empire in Providence had shrunk to 1/4 of its former size, and Desmond Whitfield, 65 years old, had lost control of most of the routes he had spent 3 decades building. He didn't die. He simply became something that, in their world, was worse than death. He no longer mattered. Garrett Mercer disappeared on a Tuesday night, 2 weeks after Paxton took the hard drive from him. His car was found in the long-term parking lot at Logan Airport, his luggage in the trunk, an unused one-way ticket to Sao Paulo inside. No one in the Calloway empire asked where Mercer had gone. No one needed to ask. And on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after Margot returned to the mansion, the Boston Globe published a small paragraph on page 14, in the legal section, the kind of item most readers skimmed past without stopping. The paragraph stated that newly provided internal records submitted to the federal court in Massachusetts had confirmed that Wyatt Fontaine, the former chief accountant, convicted of embezzlement and of providing information to the FBI 4 years earlier, was innocent of all charges, and that his conviction had been overturned after his death. Margot read that paragraph at the breakfast table in the Calloway Mansion dining room, where 3 months earlier she had stood, carrying plates and pouring wine in the role of a maid. Now she sat at the table across from Beckett, a cup of coffee in front of her, the newspaper in her hands. She read the paragraph. Read it again. Then she folded the newspaper, set it down on the table, and went silent. She didn't cry, didn't smile. She was silent in the way Beckett had learned to recognize in her, the way she handled things too large to react to right away. Then she looked up, and her eyes were bright but dry in her, and she said, My father always knew the truth would find its way out. He said that in his last letter. He said to find it, and I did. Beckett looked at her across the dining table, the morning light from the windows overlooking Boston Harbor spilling across the space between them, and he said, "And so did you. You found your way out too." Their love didn't explode into being. It didn't arrive in one single moment, with no declaration, no kiss in the rain, no vow in the middle of the night. It came the way Beckett learned the piano, awkwardly, slowly, full of mistakes, but persistent until it became real. It came in the evenings when she sat beside him at the new Steinway, teaching him the next piece for Colette. In the mornings when he poured her coffee without asking how she took it because he had remembered. In the way he began calling her by her name, Margot, not you, and the way her name sounded different in his voice from every other word he said, softer, slower, as though he was being careful with it. One night, after he had played Colette to sleep and carried her upstairs to her room, Beckett returned to the living room and found Margot still sitting at the piano, her hands resting on the keys but not playing, simply sitting there in the pale golden light. He sat beside her on the piano bench, shoulder touching shoulder, and there was just enough room on the long bench for two people, if neither of them minded being close. "You came to my house to destroy me," he said, his eyes on the keys. "Yes," she said. "Instead, you taught me to play the piano." "Yes. I think it was the best thing that ever happened to me." She turned her head to look at him, and he turned his head to look at her, and the distance between their faces was only a few inches, close enough for her to see clearly that his eyes weren't as cold as the world believed. They were only used to hiding, and now, in the empty living room near midnight, they were not hiding anymore. He kissed her. Slowly, surely, not rushed, not fierce, not the way he did anything in his underworld empire. He kissed her the way he pressed each piano key after 6 weeks of practice, one note at a time, carefully, like a man who had finally understood that there were things hands accustomed to violence had to learn again from the beginning, and tenderness was the hardest thing of all. 1 year later, the Calloway mansion on Beacon Hill, morning. Boston sunlight poured through the living room windows in long, warm, golden bands, spilling across the wooden floor, across the gray velvet sofa, across the glossy black Steinway Model B standing in the center of the room, and across the 3 people seated before that piano. Piano music filled the house, but it wasn't being played by one person. It was being played by 2. Margot sat on the left, playing the melody, her fingers moving over the keys, with the precision and emotion of someone Juilliard had once called a rare talent. But now she wasn't playing to perform. She was playing so the child sitting in her lap could listen, and that gave every note a different weight, lighter, warmer, closer. Beckett sat on the right, playing the accompaniment, simple and slow, his left hand keeping rhythm while his right pressed the basic chords that 1 year of practice had taught him by heart. He still made mistakes in places. His 3rd and 4th fingers still sometimes stuck together. There were still notes heavier than necessary because the old habits of hands accustomed to force weren't easy to erase, but the piece was complete, from beginning to end, unbroken, without stopping. And somehow that imperfection made it more perfect than any recording, because it was real. It was the sound of a father who had learned piano from nothing for the sake of his daughter, and no technique in the world could replace that. Colette sat between them. She was 6 years old now, a little bigger, her hair longer, but still the little girl with the pale brown eyes like her mother's. She sat in Margot's lap, her back resting against her father's chest, tucked between the 2 of them like a pearl between 2 halves of a shell. Her eyes closed, her head tilted, listening. Her stuffed rabbit lay in her lap, and one of her hands rested on Margot's hand over the keys, feeling Margot's fingers move beneath her own, while her other hand rested on her father's knee, touching the fabric of his trousers. And she was there in the middle, between the music, between 2 breaths, between 2 people who 1 year earlier had been enemies and now were home. She hadn't spoken yet. Dr. Ashby said she might speak, that her progress over the past 12 months had been significant, that she had made eye contact, touched other people, allowed emotion to pass through the wall of silence, and all of those things were foundations language could be built upon. But it was also possible that she wouldn't speak, not ever, and Beckett had learned to accept that possibility, not with surrender but with understanding, because his daughter's silence wasn't empty. It was full of music, full of feeling, full of ways of connection the outside world couldn't name but that were real. and he didn't need his daughter to speak to know she loved him. He only needed her to tilt her head when he played, and every night, that was enough. The piece ended. The final note lingered in the living room, then dissolved into the morning light. Beckett looked down at his daughter, her eyes still closed, her face peaceful, then looked across at Margot, and she was looking at him, and between them was the child they had both fought to keep, each in their own way, each paying their own price, but finally arriving in the same place. Beckett Calloway, boss of the empire that controlled Boston Harbor, the man the underworld called by a name no one dared say aloud, smiled. It wasn't the smile of power he used in negotiation rooms. It wasn't the polite smile he used with partners. It was the smile of a father, sitting at the piano beside his daughter in the early morning, sunlight on his face, knowing that this, exactly this, was the one thing no empire could buy, no power could steal, no $12 million or $12 billion could touch. It was the laughter of a child tilting her head to listen to music. It was awkward hands on piano keys at midnight. It was the woman who had come to destroy him, but instead taught him the thing 37 years of living had never taught him. That tenderness wasn't weakness, that trust wasn't innocence, that the strongest thing in the world wasn't a clenched hand, but an open one. The story of Beckett and Margot and Colette wasn't a fairy tale. No one was forgiven easily. No one was healed completely. Colette might never speak. Vivienne would live the rest of her life in Maine with a guilt no one would soften for her. Margot would carry the image of her father dying in a cell until the day she could no longer remember. But among all those wounds that never fully closed, there was a living room on Beacon Hill. There was morning sunlight. There was the sound of two people playing piano together, and there was a child closing her eyes and listening between the heart of her father and the heart of the woman her father had chosen. And sometimes, that was enough. Sometimes, that was everything. If this story touched something inside you, if it made you think of your father, your child, the people you love but haven't yet had the chance to tell, or the strength of tenderness in a world that can sometimes be far too harsh, I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what you think of this story, who it reminded you of, and how it connects with your real life. I read every comment, and I truly want to listen to what comes from deep within your heart. If you feel this story deserves it, please press the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on so you won't miss a new video every day. Because every day there's a new story here, and the next one may be the story meant for you. Thank you for being here, for listening, for giving your time to this story. I wish you and your loved ones good health, a joyful life, and peace and calm in each day. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.